Look at this plastic junk. What did this cost you on Amazon, Chief? 50 bucks?
Detective Wade Keller spat directly onto the gold federal shield before tossing it casually into the courtroom trash can, letting out a loud, mocking laugh.
Look at your skin. Look at that faded hoodie. A black guy driving a 12-year-old piece of trash doesn't get to play federal agent in my town. You're just a parasite, a streetlum twirl while we all your kind in the cells.
For 15 years, Keller had ruled the precinct by planting weapons, falsifying reports, and destroying lives for his own metrics. Now, he stood on the witness stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and lied to the jury without a single flicker of hesitation. He was completely certain he had won. He genuinely believed that turning off his body camera 40 seconds before the arrest meant the truth was buried forever. But Keller had made one fatal mistake. He never checked who he had actually pulled over that freezing night. He had no idea that the silent man sitting at the defendant's table wasn't a helpless victim at all. He was Julian Mercer, a senior special agent with the FBI's Public Corruption Section, sent specifically to be framed. Every single lie Keller just swore to was being recorded live into a federal indictment. And in just a matter of minutes, a hidden windshield reflection and a swarm of federal operators would turn this courtroom into his own trap. Welcome back to the channel. Let us know in the comments below which town or city you are watching this from today. Now, let's go back 19 days before the trial, to the dark street corner where the trap was first set, 19 days earlier. The city of Kestrel was locked under the kind of cold that gets into the seams of a car and stays there. 2 a.m, a 4-way stop on the east side, under a streetlight that buzzed and flickered and had been reported broken to the city 11 separate times without anyone ever coming to fix it. And parked just past that light, engine ticking as it cooled, sat a 12-year-old sedan with a cracked tail lamp and a faded hoodie behind the wheel. The man in the hoodie called himself Dante Rowe. He had a driver's license that said so, a phone with 3 months of believable text messages that said so, and a low-level courier job on the east side that said so. Everything about him was built to be exactly the kind of man that certain people in this city had decided did not deserve the benefit of the doubt. The old car, the hood up against the cold, the neighborhood, the skin, none of it was real. His name was Julian Mercer, and he was a senior special agent with the Public Corruption Section of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And the Bureau does not put a man with 23 years on the job into a freezing car as live bait for nothing. They do it because of a folder. And the folder that put Julian Mercer on that dark corner had a name written on the front of it. The name was Elijah Foster. We will come back to that name. Hold on to it. Everything that happens in this story happens because of it. For 6 months, a small federal task force had been quietly building a file on the 21st precinct, and on one detective in particular. 41 complaints in 15 years. 41. Weapons that appeared out of nowhere. Reports that read like fiction. Men who swore they were clean, and who nobody believed, because they were exactly the kind of men nobody believes. And every one of those complaints had died the same quiet death. Reviewed and closed. Reviewed and closed. Because the word of Detective Wade Keller was worth more than the word of 41 nobodies. The task force had a theory. The theory was that Keller was not a bad cop who occasionally cut a corner. The theory was that Keller was a machine for manufacturing guilt, and that he had been running for 15 years because no one had ever put something in front of him that he could not lie his way out of. So they built one. They built Dante Rowe, and they put him in Keller's hunting ground, on Keller's shift, in a car Keller could not resist. And then they did the single most important thing in the entire operation. They did nothing. They offered nothing. No bribe, no contraband, no provocation. Julian Mercer's only job that night was to be an ordinary man in an ordinary car. Break no law. And see what a 15-year predator did when he thought he had found easy prey. Because that is the difference. And it is the whole difference between a trap and a frame. A frame manufactures a crime. A trap simply opens a door and lets a man decide, entirely on his own, whether to walk through it. Wade Keller walked through it at 2 a.m. without a second of hesitation. And he brought his own gun to do it with. The cruiser came up fast. No siren. Just the wash of blue light, suddenly flooding the inside of the little sedan. Julian put both hands on the wheel where they could be seen. He had done this 100 times. On both sides of the glass. And he knew the choreography that keeps a man alive. Wade Keller stepped out of the cruiser and did not walk toward the car the way an officer walks toward a routine stop. He sauntered, and behind him, hanging back near the cruiser, was a younger man in the same uniform. A rookie by the way he stood. Shoulders tight. Hands not quite sure where to be. That younger man's name was Officer Danny Reyes, and he had been Keller's partner for exactly 11 weeks. Remember him too. He is going to matter more than anyone in that precinct could have guessed. Here is the part I need you to watch closely, because it is the hinge the entire story turns on. Before Wade Keller reached the driver's window, he stopped at the back of the sedan. In the dark, out of the streetlight, in the one patch of ground he was certain no camera in the world could see. And with his own body camera already switched off, Keller reached into his vest and took out a small pistol. It was a throwaway, the kind a dirty cop keeps for exactly this. Untraceable. Disposable. A whole human life reduced to a tool. He pressed the barrel against the steel of the rear bumper and dragged it. Hard. Scratching the serial number down to a smear. Because a gun with no history is a gun that cannot be traced back to him. He racked the slide. He wiped it once against his sleeve, and then he carried it up to the driver's window, cradled in a gloved hand. The way you carry a thing you are about to pretend you just found. Wade Keller made very sure his own camera was dark for all of it. He made sure of his camera. It did not once occur to him to wonder about the car. License. Registration. Keller didn't ask. He never asked. Julian handed them over. Calm. Unhurried. And Keller barely looked at them. He was looking at the man. At the hoodie. At the skin. At the 12-year-old car. He was reading a story he had already decided on. And then he told Julian to step out of the vehicle. And the search began. And it was theater. All of it. Because Keller already knew what he was going to find. He was the one who had brought it. Well. Keller straightened up from the passenger footwell, holding the throwaway pistol he had scratched 60 seconds earlier. And his voice climbed into something almost delighted. What do we have here? That's a whole lot of trouble for a courier. Isn't it? Chief. Serials all scratched off. 2. Now why would an honest working man be riding around at 2 a.m. with a dirty gun under his seat? He was smiling. He was, in that moment, having a wonderful time, and behind him, Officer Danny Reyes had gone very still, because Reyes had watched Keller walk to the back of the car in the dark. And Reyes was not stupid. And somewhere behind that rookie's tight shoulders, a small, terrible understanding was beginning to form. The cuffs went on too tight. They always did. With Keller. It was part of the message. And the steel bit down over the bones of Julian Mercer's wrists until the skin went white and then red. Julian said almost nothing. He gave his cover name. He said the gun was not his. Quietly. Ons. The way an innocent man says it. And Keller laughed in his face. They're not yours. Right. They're never anybody's. He leaned in close. Close enough that Julian could feel the heat of the words. Let me tell you how this goes. Chief, you're going to sit in a cell, and you're going to think about your options. And then you're going to plead to whatever my prosecutor puts in front of you. Because it is your word against a 15-year decorated detective. And I promise you, in this town, that is not a contest. You are exactly what I say you are. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked. And that, right there, is the sentence this entire channel exists to answer. You are exactly what I say you are. That is how it works. Wade Keller believed it because it had been true for 15 years. 41 times he had said a man was guilty, and 41 times the world had agreed with him. Not because of evidence, but because of who was doing the saying. He had never once, in all that time, been made to prove it. He did not know how. He had forgotten it was even possible. The cruiser door slammed, and Julian Mercer, Senior Special Agent, 23 years with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was driven to the 21st precinct in the back of a car, hands numb, wrists ringed in bruises that would still be there weeks later. A stranger's gun and a stranger's powder logged into evidence under his cover name. He did not resist. He did not argue. He did not, at any point, mention that the little sedan he had been pulled over in belonged to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and that it had been recording every second of the stop from 3 concealed angles, and that one of those angles was pointed straight out the windshield, where the glass had quietly caught something Wade Keller was absolutely certain no one on earth had seen. Julian could have ended it that night. That is the thing you have to understand about him. And it is the thing that separates this story from every story Keller had ever gotten away with. Julian Mercer had a real federal badge. A real bureau. A real team 15 minutes away. And the authority to stop the whole charade with 4 words. All he had to do was say them. I am a federal agent. And Keller would have gone pale. And the cuffs would have come off. And Julian would have gone home to a warm bed that same night. A free man. Untouched. He didn't say them. He chose the cell instead. And to understand why a man would do that, you have to understand the folder. You have to finally hear the name. Elijah Foster was 19 years old. He worked nights stocking shelves at a grocery store on the east side. And he was saving to take a certification course to fix air conditioners. Because he had figured out that in a city this hot, a man who can fix an air conditioner never goes hungry. He had a plan. He had a mother named Camille who worked 2 jobs and bragged about him to anyone who would stand still long enough to listen. And 14 months before Julian Mercer ever sat in that freezing car, Elijah Foster was pulled over by Detective Wade Keller. And a gun that Elijah had never seen before in his life appeared in his vehicle, and Elijah was arrested exactly the way Dante Rowe would later be arrested, by exactly the same man. Using exactly the same trick, Elijah told them it wasn't his. Of course he did. He told them the truth. Over and over. The way you would. The way anyone would come. And no one believed him. Because he was a 19-year-old black kid in a bad neighborhood with a decorated detective's word against him. And in this city that was not a contest, his mother could not make bail. The public defender had 90 other cases. And Elijah Foster sat in a cell, 19 years old, terrified, holding on to the belief that surely, the truth would come out, because he had done nothing wrong. And that is what he had been taught the truth was for 3 days. Elijah Foster was in that cell for 3 days. And on the 3rd day, alone, 19 years old, crushed under the weight of a lie he could not lift and could not escape and could not make anyone believe. Elijah Foster died in that cell. He never came home. He never fixed a single air conditioner. He never took the course. The official paperwork on the arrest called it a clean stop, a good bust, a gun off the street. The detective's report, the one that was, we would later learn, as fictional as everything else Wade Keller ever wrote. That is the folder. That is the name. That is why. 14 months later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation sent one of its most senior agents to put on a faded hoodie and sit in a freezing car and let Wade Keller do to him, in full, every single thing that had been done to Elijah Foster, all the way down to the cell. Because it was the only way, because Elijah's word had not been enough, and Camille's word had not been enough, and 41 other men's words had not been enough. And the only thing left on earth that might finally be enough was to feed Wade Keller a victim who could not be silenced, could not be broken, and could not be disbelieved. A victim with a badge. A victim who would let the trap close all the way around him. And then, at the exact right moment, turn around and become the hunter. So Julian Mercer went to the cell, and I need you to feel those days, because they were not a montage, and they were not easy. And the whole point of what he did is lost if you let that number slide past you. 19 days. Do not let that number go by like nothing. 19 days is a man who has run federal task forces learning to ask permission to use a toilet. It is the fluorescent light that never fully goes out, so that sleep comes in thin 10-minute pieces and leaves you more tired than before you closed your eyes. It is the food you don't finish, and the phone calls you don't make, and the specific despair of 2 in the morning when the cell breathes around you, and the walls seem to lean an inch closer than they did the night before. Julian ran drills in his own head to keep his mind from going soft. Case names and statutes, and the faces of his own children, because he had watched, in other men, exactly how fast a cage can hollow a person out. And here is the part that mattered most to him. The part he would carry into that courtroom 19 days later. He was FBI. He had a badge in his pocket and a bureau at his back and an end date fixed in his mind. Every armor a man can possibly have. And even he felt the cell begin to eat him. Even he had to rebuild himself each morning from memory. And every single one of those mornings, he thought about a 19-year-old boy who had none of that. No badge, no bureau, no end date, no armor at all. Just the truth. And the belief that the truth would save him. And that boy had lasted 3 days. Julian Mercer sat in that cell and did the math and understood, in his own body, exactly what had been done to Elijah Foster. And he did not flash his badge. And he did not go home. Because a boy had died in a room like this one. And someone was going to answer for it in front of the world. Or Julian Mercer was going to sit here until they did. On the 11th night, the cell next to his filled up. A frightened man. Arrested on something small. And frightened men talk. And this one talked all night. And when he heard that Dante Rowe had been jammed up by Keller and Reyes, he let out a bitter, knowing laugh. Reyes wrote you up. Reyes was in my paperwork too. And let me tell you something about Reyes. Kid's got a conscience. That's the sad part. Doesn't have a spine yet. But he's got a conscience. Julian said nothing. And did nothing. And let the recorder woven into the collar of his jail-issued shirt take every word of it down. He filed the name away. Reyes. A conscience? But not yet a spine. A young cop who had watched his partner walk into the dark behind a stranger's car. Julian had spent 23 years learning that the difference between a witness and an accomplice is often just one honest question asked at the right moment. By the right person. On the record, while Julian sat in that cell, the machine of the city was busy doing exactly what it always did. The case against Dante Rowe was moving fast. And it was moving fast because of a man named Gregory Vance. Assistant District Attorney Gregory Vance was, quote, on paper, a rising star, tough on crime, high conviction rate, a favorite for a judgeship. What was not on paper was the arrangement. For years, Wade Keller had fed Gregory Vance exactly the kind of easy, airtight, unwinnable for the defendant cases that a man builds a conviction rate on. And Gregory Vance had asked exactly 0 questions about where those airtight cases kept coming from. Because he did not want the answer. He wanted the numbers. He wanted the judgeship. Keller was the source, and Vance was the patron. And the two of them together had turned the manufacturing of guilt into a partnership. Vance had personally pushed the Foster case through in 3 days. Vance had personally reviewed and closed a dozen of those 41 complaints. And Vance was now personally prosecuting Dante Rowe, leaning on him to plead. Certain, absolutely certain, that this was just one more mope who would fold like all the others. He did not fold. Dante Rowe, to everyone's confusion, refused every deal, demanded a trial, and was assigned a defense attorney named Diane Ellison. And what nobody in that courthouse knew, not Vance, not Keller, not the judge, was that Diane Ellison had met privately 3 weeks earlier with the public corruption section of the FBI, and that she knew exactly who her silent, patient client really was, and exactly what was sitting on the hard drive pulled from that 12-year-old car. The trap was built. The bait had been taken. The predator had committed the crime. On his own. Entirely of his own free will. Now all that remained was to arm the jaws. Wait for Wade Keller to climb up onto a witness stand and put his hand on a Bible and say it all out loud. Under oath. In front of God and a court reporter and a jury. And then spring it. The trial of the people versus Dante Rowe began on a gray morning in a courtroom on the 4th floor. And for the first day and a half, it went exactly the way Wade Keller expected it to go. Which is to say, it went beautifully. Gregory Vance was smooth and confident. He walked the jury through the arrest. The gun. The scratched serial number. The courier with the record-friendly profile. He was good. He had done this many times. And then, on the second morning, he called his star witness. And Detective Wade Keller walked to the front of the courtroom in a pressed suit. And he placed his right hand on the Bible. And he swore to tell the truth. The whole truth. And nothing but the truth. And then he sat down and lied for 45 minutes without a single flicker. He testified that he had pulled the vehicle over for a broken tail lamp. True enough. He testified that during a lawful search, he had discovered a firearm with a defaced serial number under the passenger seat. And here he looked at the jury. Varm. Sincere. A public servant doing a hard job. And he told them he had recovered that weapon in the course of protecting this community from exactly the kind of danger they had all moved to the suburbs to escape. He testified that his body camera had, unfortunately, stopped recording shortly before the stop. A cold battery, he explained. A known issue in these temperatures. Nothing anyone could do about it. He said it with a small, regretful shrug. The shrug of an honest man let down by cheap equipment. And half the jury nodded along. Because who among them had not had a phone die in the cold? And then Diane Ellison stood up to cross-examine. And she was gentle, almost deferential. And she asked Wade Keller a series of small, quiet, careful questions. And she let him grow comfortable. And she let him grow certain. And she walked him, one polite step at a time, out onto the thinnest possible ice. Detective, just so the jury is clear, your camera was off. There's no video of the search itself. That's correct. Mom. Battery. Like I said. So the jury has your word for what happened at that car. They have my 15 years. Mom. And here Wade Keller could not help himself. Because for 15 years his word had been enough. And he had come to believe that it was a kind of magic that could never fail. They have the word of a decorated officer of this city against the word of a man with a gun under his seat. I'd say that's a pretty easy call. I'd agree with you. Detective, Diane Ellison said quietly. I think it's about to be a very easy call. And she asked him, one last time, to confirm for the jury, plainly and clearly and on the record, that his account was complete and truthful, and that there was nothing about that stop he had left out. And Wade Keller, comfortable, certain, victorious, looked the jury dead in the eye and swore that there was not. It was, he said, exactly as he had described it. Every word. You just watched a man lock the door of his own cage from the inside. He simply did not know it yet. Diane Ellison thanked him. And then she did something that made Gregory Vance sit up in his chair, because it broke the rhythm of a routine trial. And men like Vance survive on rhythm. Your Honor, she said. The defense calls the defendant to the stand. There was a rustle in the room. Defendants rarely testify. It is dangerous. But the man who had called himself Dante Rowe for 19 days rose from the defense table, walked to the front of that courtroom in his cheap clothes, with the bruises still faintly ringing his wrists, and placed his right hand on the same Bible Wade Keller had just used, and swore the same oath. And then he sat, and he looked out at the room, calm, unhurried, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. State your name for the record. Diane Ellison said, and here it comes. This is the moment. This is why you are watching. My name? The man in the hoodie said, in a voice that had suddenly nothing of Dante Rowe left in it. A voice that filled the room. Is not Dante Rowe. The courtroom went silent in that particular way. A room goes silent when it senses, before it understands, that the ground has shifted. My name is Julian Mercer. I am a senior special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am assigned to the Public Corruption Section. And 19 days ago, I was sent to the east side of this city in a bureau vehicle, under a bureau cover identity, as part of a federal investigation into Detective Wade Keller and the systematic manufacturing of criminal cases inside the 21st Precinct. And then Julian Mercer reached into the collar of his jail shirt, and he drew out a thin cord, and on the end of it hung a gold federal shield. The real one. The one that had been against his skin through every one of those 19 nights. And he lifted it over his head, and he set it down on the wooden rail of the witness box with a single, soft, the final click that the microphone caught and carried to every corner of that room. It was the same badge Wade Keller had spat on. The same badge he had called plastic junk and $50 of Amazon garbage and thrown in the trash. And it had been real the entire time. I want you to picture Wade Keller's face, because he had spent 15 years being the man who knew things other people did not. The man 3 steps ahead. And in that one instant, every one of those 15 years drained out of him at once. He did not shout. He did not object. His mouth came open a little, and no sound came out of it. And he stared at that gold shield sitting on the rail like it was a thing that had crawled up out of a nightmare. And for the first time in his adult life, Detective Wade Keller understood that he had been the one who was easy prey. That the door he had walked through so eagerly at 2 a.m. had been held open for him on purpose. And that he had brought his own gun, scratched his own serial number, killed his own camera, and just now, moments ago, sworn his own lies to a jury, under oath, with his hand on a Bible, while a federal agent sat 6 feet away and let him. Gregory Vance was on his feet. Objection. Your Honor. Sidebar. This is highly irregular. The people had no notice. And the judge, an older man who had seen a great deal from that bench, but never this, held up one hand and told Mr. Vance to sit down, because the judge, unlike Vance, had understood exactly what was happening, and the judge wanted very badly to see what came next. What came next was the machine, because here is the thing about Wade Keller's magic. The thing he had leaned on for 15 years. It only worked in the dark. It worked because it was always his word against theirs. And there was never, ever a third voice in the room. He had built his entire career on making sure of that. He killed his camera every single time. He picked victims no one would believe. He operated in the one space on Earth where the only witnesses were a liar and his victim. And he had made himself very, very good at controlling both. But Julian Mercer had not come to make it his word against Keller's. Julian Mercer had come to make it Keller's word against a machine. And a machine does not care about your 15 years. A machine cannot be intimidated in a cell. A machine keeps its own diary. In the dark. 40 seconds at a time. And it cannot be talked out of a single thing it saw. Your Honor, Diane Ellison said. The defense moves to enter Federal Exhibit 1. Recovered from the vehicle, Detective Keller stopped that night. The vehicle was a bureau vehicle. It was equipped, as all such vehicles are, with a concealed continuous recording system, 3 cameras, none of them ever turned off. I'd like to show the jury what one of them saw. The screen came down, and what played on it, in cold, grainy, undeniable color, was the back of that 12-year-old sedan. In the dark, just past the broken streetlight, and there was Wade Keller, not at the window. At the trunk, in the shadow he had been so certain was empty, and the camera pointed out through the windshield caught it not directly but in reflection. In the glass itself, the way a mirror catches the thing behind you. And in that reflection, every single person in that courtroom watched Detective Wade Keller reach into his own vest, pull out a small pistol, drag its barrel down the steel of the bumper to scratch away the serial number, rack the slide, wipe it on his sleeve, and carry it up toward the driver's window in a gloved hand. 40 seconds before he would pretend to find it. In the exact window of time, his own body camera was dark. The gun he swore he recovered from under the seat. The jury watched him bring it. In his own hand. From his own vest, you could hear the room stop breathing. A woman in the 3rd row put her hand over her mouth. 2 of the jurors turned and looked directly at Wade Keller. And something in their faces had changed forever. Because they had spent a day and a half being told to weigh a detective's word against a courier's. And they had just been handed a 3rd thing. A thing with no side and no career and no agenda. And the 3rd thing had shown them the truth in the dark. And then, because a good trap has more than one set of teeth, Diane Ellison had the technician freeze the image. And she matched it. The scratched serial number visible in the reflection. The exact pattern of the gouge Keller had dragged across the bumper. Microscopically matched the scratch on the gun, sitting in the evidence bag on the clerk's table. The same gun, the same scratch, the same hand. There was no cold battery. There was no honest mistake. There was a man who had brought a weapon to plant it and had been filmed doing it by a car he never thought to check. Wade Keller was no longer certain. Wade Keller was no longer anything. He sat in the witness box, with his hand still resting near the Bible he had lied on. And he watched a thing he had believed was solid ground open up beneath his boots. And for one long moment the mask came all the way off. And what was underneath it was the most dangerous thing in that entire room. Because it was not a monster. It was a man who believed he was right. Detective. Diane Ellison said quietly. Would you like to explain to the jury what they just saw? And Wade Keller lifted his head. And for the first time in 2 days, he stopped performing. And what came out of him instead was the thing he actually believed. Spoken plain. The quiet part, said out loud at last. You want to talk about a scratch on a gun? His voice was low, and it did not shake. Because he meant every word of it. Fine. Let's talk about the block that gun came off of. You people sit in this clean room. In your clean suits. And not one of you has ever stood on that corner at 2 a.m. I have. For 15 years I have stood there. So that you could sleep. I know who's holding and who isn't the way you know your own children's faces. That man is exactly what I said he was. Badge or no badge. And maybe I didn't do it by your book. But I have kept this city breathing, while people like you wrote rules for a war you have never once had to fight. I am the line. Do you understand that I am the only thing standing between the decent people in this town and the animals? You take me out of the way? You are not saving anybody. You are just letting the dark come in. He said it like a prayer. He said it like a man who had told himself that same sentence on so many nights that it had become the last true thing he owned. And that was the real horror of Wade Keller. And I want you to sit with it. Because it is more frightening than any cartoon villain. It was not that he had planted a gun on a federal agent. It was that he had planted guns on 100 men who were not federal agents. Men like Elijah Foster. And had driven home every single time, believing he was the hero of the story. He had mistaken his own contempt for courage for so long that he could no longer tell the two of them apart. Julian Mercer looked at him from the front of that courtroom and felt no triumph at all. Only the old, tired recognition of exactly what he had been sent to stop, the line. Diane Ellison repeated softly. Between order and the animals. She let it hang in the air so the jury could taste it. Then she turned back to the screen. Let's see how carefully the guardian of the line documents his own work. Because she was not finished. She had shown them what he did. Now she was going to show them that he had meant to do it. Detective, you told this jury your camera failed because of the cold. A battery. A known issue. Let's look at what the camera itself has to say about how it failed. She brought up a second exhibit. Plain white text on a black field. Timestamps and codes. The unglamorous private diary of a machine. This is the internal data log from Detective Keller's own body camera. When a cold battery kills a camera, it leaves a very specific fingerprint. A voltage warning. A gradual shutdown. An aeroflog. That is not what this log shows. She highlighted a single line. This shows a manual deactivation. A button. Pressed and held for 3 full seconds. The deliberate 3-second press the manufacturer designed to be difficult to do by accident. Precisely so that a camera cannot be switched off without meaning it. The camera did not die. It was switched off. By hand, 40 seconds before the stop, and then switched back on again. By hand. Once the gun was safely on the record and the story was set, she turned to the jury. He did not lose the footage. He chose the darkness. He reached down, and he made the darkness on purpose, because he knew exactly what he was about to do. And he had done it so many times before that turning off the light had become part of the routine. This was not a mistake. This was a method, and he has been using it for 15 years. For a moment, for one dangerous moment, it looked like there might still be a way out for Wade Keller. And Gregory Vance seized it. Because a drowning man will grab anything, Vance was on his feet again. And now he was arguing to the judge that this whole thing, the cover, the bait, the car, the operation, was entrapment. That the FBI had lured his detective into a trap and manufactured a crime, and that a reflection in a windshield proved nothing about a man's intent. and the words came fast and slick. And for a heartbeat, the air in that courtroom wobbled, because it is a frightening thing to watch a good lie fight for its life. And Diane Ellison let him finish. And then she took the wobble and she closed it forever. Entrapment, she said, is when the government plants the idea of a crime in the mind of a person not otherwise inclined to commit it. The government did not hand Detective Keller a gun. The government did not tell him to scratch the serial. The government did not suggest, request, encourage, or induce a single thing that happened at the back of that car. Agent Mercer broke no law. He offered no bribe. He resisted nothing. He sat in a car. Everything Detective Keller did, he brought with him, in his own vest, out of his own free will, from a habit 15 years deep. You cannot entrap a man into being what he already is. All we did was open a door and film him running through it. And as for the reflection proving nothing about intent, Your Honor, we are not relying on the reflection for intent. We have the intent on the record in his own camera's own hand. 3 seconds. Held down. On purpose. That is not a reflection. That is a confession the machine wrote for him while he wasn't looking. The judge listened to all of it. And then the judge looked at Gregory Vance for a long, cold moment. And the judge said, quietly, that he was denying the motion, and that Mr. Vance would do well to sit down and say nothing further, because the judge was beginning to wonder whether the people's table had more than one person at it who ought to be very worried right now. And Gregory Vance sat down, and that, though he did not yet know it, was the sound of a second cage door closing. Diane Ellison had one witness left. Your Honor, she said, the defense calls Officer Daniel Reyes. And the rookie, the young man with the tight shoulders and, according to a stranger in a cell, a conscience but not yet a spine, rose from the gallery where he had been sitting all morning with his hat in his hands, and walked to the stand, and swore the oath, and you could see him shaking. Here is what you need to understand about Danny Reyes. For 11 weeks he had ridden next to Wade Keller and told himself a story, the same story 1,000 young cops have told themselves, that the veteran must know something he didn't, that this was how the job really worked, that his discomfort was just inexperience. He had watched Keller walk into the dark behind that sedan. He had felt, in his gut, exactly what it meant, and he had said nothing, filed nothing, because saying something meant the end of everything. The academy, the pension, the brotherhood, the only future he had ever planned. Danny Reyes had a conscience, what he had not had until this exact moment. That was a reason to be brave that was bigger than his fear. And now, sitting in that box, he had one. He had a gold badge on a rail and a dead 19-year-old in a folder and a partner who had just been filmed doing the thing Danny had spent 11 weeks pretending he hadn't seen. Diane Ellison asked him gently what he had witnessed that night. And Danny Reyes closed his eyes for a second. And then he opened them. And he chose the harder thing. He told the truth. He testified that he had seen Detective Keller go to the rear of the vehicle, out of the light, before approaching the driver, which was not procedure and made no sense. He testified that he had never seen the gun before Keller produced it. He testified, his voice cracking, that in 11 weeks he had watched Wade Keller run 3 stops that had felt exactly like this one, and that he had said nothing, and that he would have to live with that. And then Diane Ellison asked him one more question. The question the FBI had built an entire operation to be able to ask on the record, and it was about the folder, and it was about a name, Officer Reyes. In your time at the 21st Precinct, did you ever become aware of Detective Keller's involvement in the arrest of a young man named Elijah Foster? And Danny Reyes said yes. And Danny Reyes testified that after Elijah Foster died in that cell, he had watched Wade Keller and, later, someone from the district attorney's office quietly make a file disappear, an internal complaint that Camille Foster had filed, begging someone to look at what had really happened to her son. He testified that he had seen Keller laugh about it, and that laugh, that specific laugh, the same mocking laugh Keller had let out at the back of the sedan, the same laugh he would later let out over a federal badge in a trash can, was the thing Danny Reyes could not carry anymore. And it was the thing that finally gave a young man with a conscience his spine. That testimony did two things at once. It sealed Wade Keller's fate, and it opened a brand new door, straight into the office of Assistant District Attorney Gregory Vance. Because making an official complaint disappear to cover a death in custody is not a lapse in judgment. It is a federal crime. It is obstruction. And Gregory Vance, sitting at the people's table, felt the temperature of the room change around him, and understood, far too late, that he was no longer the prosecutor in this courtroom. He was a target. And now, the swarm. Because everything you have watched, the reveal, the reflection, the metadata, the confession, the rookie, all of it, had been recorded live, exactly as the hook promised, straight into a federal indictment. The FBI had not come to win a state trial about a courier with a gun. The FBI had come to build a federal case against a corrupt detective and his patron in the district attorney's office. And Wade Keller had just spent 45 minutes on a witness stand, handing them every single element of it under oath. The trap was never the little sedan. The little sedan was just the bait. The trap was this room. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. They came in fast, and they came in quiet. A line of federal agents in bureau windbreakers, badges out, moving with the unhurried certainty of people who already know how the next 60 seconds are going to go, and a woman at the front of them, a senior agent, walked straight up the center aisle past the gallery, past the people's table, past Gregory Vance, who had gone the gray color of a man watching his entire life fold up. And she stopped in front of the witness box where Detective Wade Keller sat. And she looked at him without any anger at all, which was somehow worse than anger. "Detective Wade Keller," she said, and her voice carried to the back of the room. "You're under arrest for the deprivation of civil rights under color of law, for perjury, for evidence tampering, and for obstruction of justice." And then she added, quietly, the words that turned it from a career ender into a life sentence. "Given the death of Elijah Foster in connection with a case you fabricated, the civil rights charge carries the possibility of life." Wade Keller did not run. There was nowhere to run to. And some part of him, the part that had said, "I am the line," still could not believe this was real. They brought him down out of the witness box, and they turned him around, and they put his hands behind his back, and the cuffs went on. And I promise you the camera was rolling for that. His hands, behind his back, the steel closing over the bones of his wrists, in front of a full courtroom, in front of the jury he had lied to, in front of the young officer who had finally told the truth, in front of the federal agent he had called a parasite and a street mope, and a black guy in a faded hoodie who didn't get to play federal agent in his town. And at the same moment, at the people's table, 2 more agents were standing over Gregory Vance. And Gregory Vance was being informed that he was under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy, for the disappearance of Camille Foster's complaint, and for a partnership with Wade Keller that a very thorough folder had been documenting for 6 months. The rising star, the favorite for the judgeship, handcuffed at his own prosecution table in the middle of his own trial, because here is a truth this channel comes back to again and again. The cop who plants the gun is only ever the hand. There is almost always someone in a nicer suit who makes sure the hand never gets caught. And the real victory, the one that actually changes anything, is not putting away the hand. It is reaching past the hand and taking down the man who protected it. Wade Keller ruined lives. Gregory Vance made Wade Keller possible, and on that gray morning, both of them went down together. Julian Mercer stood up from the witness box, picked his gold shield up off the rail, and hung it back around his neck where it belonged. He did not smile. He looked, for a moment, very tired. The tired of a man who has just spent 19 days in a cell and knows exactly what it cost, and knows that even at its most complete, this kind of victory only ever arrives after the person who most deserved to see it is already gone. The case of the People versus Dante Rowe was dismissed that afternoon. Dante Rowe had never existed. But before it was dismissed, and before the federal indictments truly went to work, one more voice needed to be heard. Because a story about Elijah Foster that does not include his mother is not a story worth telling. At Wade Keller's federal sentencing, months later, Camille Foster was given the chance to speak, and she walked to the front of a very different courtroom holding a single framed photograph against her chest. And she turned it around so the room could see her son's face. 19 years old, grinning, alive, a boy who had wanted to fix air conditioners. His name was Elijah, she said. He was going to take a course. He wanted to fix air conditioners. Because he said in a city this hot, a man who can do that never goes hungry. He had a plan. He was 19. She stopped, and her composure thinned, not into tears, but into something harder. The flat, scoured calm of a woman who has already cried every tear she had. Years ago, into a pillow no one heard. I want you to understand what I did after, she said. I did not fall apart, though I wanted to. I made copies. I kept every letter. I sat on a bench in a hallway in this very building more times than I can count. And I asked the people who work here to just look at my son's face, and look at that detective's record, and ask themselves one honest question. And every single time, someone in a nice suit told me the file was closed, that the matter had been reviewed, that my son had a record, as if a record is the same thing as a reason, as if it meant he had earned it. Her jaw tightened. It took a federal agent with a hidden camera and a windshield and 40 seconds of a machine's memory to make you believe the exact thing I have been telling you with my own mouth for over a year. My word was never going to be enough. My son's word was never going to be enough. We did not have the right kind of proof. We did not have the right kind of anything. She turned the photograph back toward herself and pressed it to her chest. Agent Mercer had a badge, she said quietly, and even he had to go and get himself arrested and thrown in a cell for 19 days before anyone in this system would look. My Elijah had nothing but the truth, and the truth was not enough to save him. So I am going to ask this court the only thing I have left to ask. My son needed exactly one person, in a uniform or a suit, to believe him for 3 days. Just 3 days. And no one did. I need you to tell me why the truth needed a federal badge, standing behind it before it counted. Because until somebody in this country can answer that question, my son will not be the last one who dies in a cell for a crime that a man in a uniform brought with him in his own vest. There was no sound in that courtroom when she finished. Applause would have been obscene. There was only a room full of people who had, until that morning, been fairly sure they knew the difference between the guilty and the innocent, and who would never again be quite that sure, because a mother had just shown them how thin the only thing protecting the innocent really was, and how easily it could be switched off, by hand, in the dark, for 3 seconds. by a man who believed he was the hero. The sentences came down. For Wade Keller, on the federal civil rights charge connected to the death of Elijah Foster, plus perjury, plus evidence tampering, plus obstruction. The court handed down 51 years. 51. The line between civilization and the animals, as he had called himself, would be spending the rest of his natural life on the other side of the bars he had spent 15 years putting other men behind. For Gregory Vance, the patron, the rising star, for obstruction and conspiracy, 22 years, and the disbarment that ended not just his career, but the entire clean story he had told about himself. And for Officer Danny Reyes, the young man who found his spine on a witness stand, cooperation, and a long, uncertain road, but a road he chose to walk with his eyes open, which is more than his partner ever did. There is one last image I want to leave you with, and it is a small one, but it stayed with everyone who was in that room. When they processed Wade Keller into federal custody, they emptied his pockets, and among his things was a small medal on a chain, worn smooth with handling. It was a St. Michael medal. St. Michael, the patron saint of police officers, the protector, the one who is supposed to guard the innocent and cast out the wicked. Wade Keller had carried it every day for 15 years, right next to the throwaway guns and the lies. And he had never once seen the contradiction, because in his own mind he had always been Michael, and everyone he destroyed had always been the wicked. They logged the medal into an evidence bag with the rest of his property, and they walked him to a cell, and the door closed. And for the first time, Wade Keller was on the inside of it. 19 days had been enough to teach a federal agent exactly what that cell could do to a man. Wade Keller was going to have 51 years to learn the same lesson. But do not mistake the sentences for the victory. The men in the cells were never the point. The victory was quieter, and it belonged to other people. And most of them will never be on a single camera. It was 41 closed files pried back open, one folder at a time. In a records room that smelled of dust and other people's ruin, it was the 11 men, so far, walking out of prisons on cases Wade Keller had built. Men whose mothers had also sat on that hallway bench, who had also been told the matter was reviewed, who had also been asked to accept that a record was the same thing as a reason. It was a judge who would spend his last years on the bench signing away his own signature, undoing conviction after conviction, because he felt he had signed each of the originals. It was a courtroom that finally, more than a year too late, let a mother finish her sentence out loud. And it was the name Elijah Foster, cleared at last. The fabricated charge struck from the record, so that on every piece of paper anywhere in that state, a 19-year-old boy who had wanted to fix air conditioners was no longer, and would never again be, a criminal, 19 years old forever, but innocent. Now, in writing, the way he had been innocent all along, Julian Mercer went back to being a name almost no one knows. He took off the hoodie and became a senior special agent again, and moved on to the next folder, and the next name, because there is always a next name. That was fine with him. The people who mattered in this story were never the ones with the badges. They were the boy who died, believing the truth would save him, and the mother who refused to stop saying his name, and the frightened rookie who finally decided he would rather lose everything than laugh along one more time. So let me leave you where this whole thing started. At a four-way stop under a broken streetlight, with a detective who was completely certain that a man is exactly what a man in a uniform says he is. Wade Keller was wrong. But he was only wrong this one time because the man he framed happened to be carrying a federal badge and a car with 3 hidden cameras, and the full weight of the bureau behind him, So here's the question I want you to sit with tonight. And I want you to answer it honestly in the comments below. How many Wade Kellers are still out there right now? In how many towns? Absolutely certain they have won. Sleeping soundly, with a St. Michael medal in their pocket. Precisely because the last man they framed did not have a badge. Elijah Foster didn't have one. His truth was not enough. And the only reason you know his name at all is that this one time, the truth got lucky. And the truth almost never gets lucky. Tell me the name of your town in the comments. Tell me whether you think the truth would be enough there. On a dark corner, at 2 in the morning, if it were just your word against a badge, and if this story moved you, if you believe that a boy like Elijah deserved 3 days of someone simply choosing to believe him, then subscribe. And stay with this channel, because there is always another folder, and there is always another name, and every single one of them deserves to be heard.